So Dan is a guy who's very in touch with himself. Like all these speakers, he's very introspective. And I welcome him to the stage, Dan Schnur. Enjoy a TED Talk from Dan Schnur.
Wow. Well, as a former and almost recovered political consultant, it's good to be back. Thank you for having me here. Chris, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It might not have sounded like all that much to you guys, but it's midterm week at USC. And so that's the nicest thing anyone has said about me in public all week long, Chris. I appreciate it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to contradict what he told you. Chris told you not to check email or Facebook over the course of these presentations. I'm a little bit more realistic than that. We've each been told to talk for 10 or 12 minutes. I can't go 10 or 12 minutes without checking email, and I'm speaking. So if at a certain point in a few minutes I have to log in, just excuse me, and you guys should feel free to do the same thing. But in a room full of political consultants, I really do think we should be realistic about this, Chris. So as he mentioned, I fled political consulting years and years ago. And for the last many years, I've been working at teaching, both at the University of California, Berkeley, but also full-time at the University of Southern California. And I tell you, all jokes aside, I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns, on 3 campaigns for governor of California, working to prepare our next generation of young leaders, some of whom are, by the way, who are at this conference this week, is the best job I've ever had. I like to believe that I have the 3rd best job at the University of Southern California after our president, Max Nikias, and our football coach, Clay Helton. For those of you who are football fans, you know that earlier this year, back in September, I had the 2nd best job at the University of Southern California. And if there are any Stanford or Alabama fans in the audience, I will seek you out later. But then we won 9 in a row in the Rose Bowl, so now I'm back to 3rd best where I belong. And one of the many, many things I get to do at the University of Southern California, is I've served for many years until the end of 2016, is the director of the USC LA Times statewide political survey. In 2008, those of you with long memories may remember that the LA Times for years ran a state and national poll of their own. After the 2008 election, their poll, they pulled the plug on their poll. And so almost exactly 8 years ago, I went to the editors of the Times and I suggested to them that we join forces. And for 8 years, for 8 solid years, the statewide USC LA Times poll was the most accurate survey in the state of California. Now, credit goes not to me, despite that. Credit goes not to me, but to the really, really smart and accomplished polling firms that we were wise enough to hire. And my friends at Greenberg Quinlan on one side of the aisle and at American Viewpoint on the other side did tremendous work year in and year out for us in statewide polling for governor's races, for Senate campaigns, for ballot initiatives, and a whole range of public policy issues. So about 1.5 years ago, a colleague of mine at SC, a guy by the name of Ari Captain. Ari is a brilliant man who runs a program in our College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences called the Center for Economic and Social Research. The Center for Economic and Social Research, and yes, Reed, the acronym is CSER, no lie. They developed in 2012 a polling model, along with some colleagues at Rand Corporation, that polled the 2012 campaign by measuring not voter preference, as most traditional public opinion polls, ours included, does, but what they measured instead of voter preference was rather voter intensity. And in 2012, they came within less than 1 percentage point of the final Obama-Romney numbers, for reasons I'll describe in just a couple of minutes. But Ari came to me a couple years back to say that he wanted to try out this methodology on a broader stage, on a larger platform. And hence the USC LA Times night-wide tracking poll, or as we called it, the Daybreak poll, was born. Now, as you heard a moment ago, and as all of you know from following the campaign, our poll was one of the only, and often the only, major national poll that consistently showed Donald Trump either running ahead or running well ahead of Hillary, either running ahead of Hillary Clinton or running much stronger against her than any of the other mainstream polls. And the reason for that was the difference in methodology. And as I mentioned earlier, what we did is instead of measuring voter preference, are you supporting candidate A or candidate B? Are you supporting Clinton or Trump? What we asked instead was, on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you of your vote for your preferred candidate? And on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you that you are going to vote? And what we found day after day, week after week, month after month, all summer and all fall long, is something all of you know, which is that while there are more Americans who supported Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, and our poll reflected that, Trump's supporters were much more certain, much more fervent, and therefore much more motivated on behalf of their candidate than Clinton's were on behalf of her candidacy. In other words, these white working class men who hadn't bothered to turn out for Mitt Romney or for John McCain or for George W. Bush, and therefore were not considered likely voters in most polls because of past voting history or lack thereof. They kept telling us day after day, week after week, month after month, not just that they were going to vote for Trump, but they were in the 90s up to 100 in terms of certainty. While the young people and the voters from minority communities who would not have voted for Donald Trump if you put a gun to their head and a knife to their throat, they told us they were for Hillary Clinton, but with a much lower level of certainty all year long. So as the poll progressed, those of us with some experience in politics and public opinion research kept waiting for the numbers to change. Said, well, Clinton's voters will get more motivated at a certain point, and these working class voters' enthusiasm will dissipate. Well, once the absentee ballots begin to be turned in, once early voting starts, the superior Clinton ground organization will cause the numbers to change. And we kept telling each other that the numbers were about to change. And of course they didn't. And after getting beaten up all summer and all fall for a poll that showed Trump running stronger than Clinton, by the way, the original title for this talk was, I was a thermometer, not a thermostat. Because you have no idea how angry a Clinton supporter can be when he or she thinks you are cooking the numbers against their candidate. I learned that this past year. We kept waiting for the numbers to change. And they didn't. And I will admit to you, just the 150 of us, can we keep this between us? Probably not, oh well. On election day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, California time, 8 o'clock on the East Coast when the polls were starting to close, I was teaching a class called Case Studies in Modern Leadership. We study leaders from politics, from business, from nonprofits, from communications, even from the military and sports. And the students are asked to help develop a theory on the skills that make somebody a successful leader regardless of their field. And on election day, November 7th, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon Pacific time, we were having an earnest conversation in class about whether President-elect Hillary Clinton would be up for the leadership challenges she would face. 5 o'clock on election day, that's how confident I was in our poll numbers. That night on campus, we were hosting a viewing. In our Annenberg Forum, we had 1,500 students there. 1,475 of whom were there for a Hillary party. And as the night went on, and as someone who grew up in the state of Wisconsin and keeps a close eye on those states' politics, and I kept waiting for counties to turn blue, and when I realized they weren't going to, I took our panel of experts aside, and I said, okay, guys, we're going to switch from punditry to therapy, which is what was needed for the rest of the evening, I'm guessing not just in our forum also. So ever since Election Day, after weeks and months of getting beaten up for having a poll that showed Donald Trump ahead, after the election, people are now throwing whatever the political equivalent of rose petals are at our feet. What are the political equivalent of rose petals? Karen? Okay, they're rose petals, but never mind. They're saying, oh, this was the one poll that was right. USC and the LA Times nailed it. Way to go, Schnurr. And the great thing about not being a political consultant anymore is I don't have to pretend I'm right when I'm not. And what I have been pointing out to anyone who's asked me ever since Election Day is thank you for the compliments, because I think our poll was a very valuable one. But we weren't right. We were wrong. And invariably, these people look very, very puzzled. And they say, what do you mean you were wrong? You picked Donald Trump. And I said, yeah, but we don't poll the Electoral College. On Election Day, our poll showed Donald Trump winning the popular vote by 3 points. Well, I think most of you know this. He did not. And I believe that's been covered to some degree in the weeks and months since the election, so I don't think I have to belabor that any further. That said, and this may sound like a rationalization only because it probably sort of almost is. Now, all kidding aside, most of you know that the real purpose of a good poll is not to predict an outcome. The real purpose of an effective political opinion tool is to give you insight into the voters that otherwise you might not have gotten. So no, we did not pick the outcome of the presidential election. We were wrong about that, and should the time exist, I'm more than happy a little bit later today to tell you individually or in smaller groups why we didn't nail it. But if the purpose of a poll is to give you insight into what voters are thinking, in that respect, I'm very proud of what we accomplished. Because long before the voters of Michigan and Pennsylvania and my home state of Wisconsin went to the polls, we had been demonstrating conclusively and statistically for over 6 months that Donald Trump's voters, while outnumbered, were more fervent and more motivated and more certain in support of his candidacy than Clinton supporters were on behalf of hers. And all of us intuited that, but none of us knew it. And the nice thing about the USC LA Times poll is that we had the data to substantiate it. Now, that said, we were wrong. Why were we wrong? For a few reasons. The most notable being is that a poll like ours, particularly a nightly tracking panel poll, for a national electorate, we have a sample that is spread equally between every county in the country. And as I know all of you know, in this election, given the unprecedented in modern history skew between the urban and rural electorate, because we spread our sample evenly between all counties, urban and rural alike, we oversampled the rural electorate. And that caused us to inflate Trump's poll numbers. And in some way, I'm almost thankful for that. Because if we had not missed that, and if we had accurately picked the election in advance, I would be absolutely effing insufferable. Now, my friend Reed Galen, who's going to talk in a minute, is going to tell you that I am insufferable anyway, and have been for many years. But imagine even more. And what I learned from our experiment, and this is the great thing about being at a university, is you get to experiment. You get to try things, you get to take risks, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, but you get to try to break new ground, and I'm glad that we were able to take on this experiment and break new ground. And so what I learned this year is that a poll of voter intensity rather than a voter preference is not better than a traditional polling model, but it's not worse. And the kind of polling we did this year, the USC LA Times Daybreak poll, should not be a substitute for the traditional polling model, but rather should be a complement for it. What we all know in every walk of our life, that if you only measure something by one standard, by definition, you're only getting an incomplete picture. If you only measure a baseball player by batting average, if you only measure a company's economic success by its stock price, you're getting part of the picture, not the whole thing. And so the lesson I learned in this election, the two lessons I learned in this election is, one, like everything else in our lives, if you use a variety of measurements to assess a situation, in this case, both a voter preference survey and a voter intensity poll, then you can get a much fuller picture than using just one or the other. And the other thing I learned is don't have class on election day, because you're going to look really stupid by the next morning. Thank you very much for having me. Enjoy your stay.